Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Audio Fanfics and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is, what if Naruto's divine blood made Kunoichi worship his touch, Hinata, Tsunade, Konan, and May in his forbidden harem. Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Naruto frowned slightly as he stood in the blonde Hokage's office. When he received word he was getting a solo mission that was possibly a rank, well hell Naruto was ready to throw a party. Never one to turn down a mission, unless it was D rank. Naruto hauled out of his apartment, fell down twice because he was still putting his orange pants on, then became a blur of speed as he zipped to the Hokage's tower, but now that he was here, he was not so sure he wanted to go as he looked at Tsunade over the folder he was reading. You're joking, right? This is a joke. Tsunade frowned at him as she began tapping the fingers of her left hand on the desk. Naruto looked back in the folder and picked up the lone sheet of paper and looked at both sides of it before peeking around it at the Hokage. Is it possible this is a joke? He said with a hint of hope in his voice. Tsunade only scowled at him now, her fingers beating a much more rapid tattoo on the desk. Naruto looked at the paper again and read the contents for the third time before looking up at Tsunade, who now was wearing a pattern in the desk shaped like her fingertips. She was drumming the desk so hard. In a higher-pitched squeaky voice Naruto looked at his surrogate sister and stuttered. Could it be a joke? Tsunade leaned forward across her desk, eyes smoldering as her fingers stopped their repetition. Would you like me to show you the joke, Naru-chan? Her voice, while fairly even, held the hint of immense pain and discomfort in store for his immediate future. In the same squeaky voice Naruto whispered. When do I leave? Tsunade sat back and nodded her head in a satisfied manner. Understand, Naruto, this isn't a standard mission, and if there is a threat to the city, you are not to engage. Naruto nodded his head glumly as he looked over the paper again, trying to commit the boring assignment to memory. At least he would be in wave, it could be much worse. Bachan, not arguing with you, but why would you send me on a mission like this? Wouldn't Kiba or Neji be more suited for a scouting mission? Tsunade ran a hand through her hair before she nodded. You're right, but I thought of you because they may need a heavy hitter on hand until reinforcements arrive. Naruto felt his chest puff in pride as she continued. They needed my best. And Naruto burst into a grin that would rival a kid in a candy store. They need a ninja among ninja. Tsunade said as her voice hit a peak as Naruto stood from his chair, a proud faraway look in his eyes. But you were all I had available, so off you go. She said with a grin as Naruto fell back in the chair, deflating like a popped balloon. Bachan, he shouted in indignation, but she shook him off with a grin on her face. I'm just teasing, Naruto. Truth is, I do have confidence in you, but I have no scouts available for this mission. Now this could be nothing, but homes on the outskirts of Wave have been getting raided, but it looks like the only things that have been taken are minor things. Naruto frowned as he blinked at her. A petty thief. Tsunade shrugged before she crossed her legs. So it seems. But whoever is doing it is only stealing baubles, knickknacks, food, money or valuables have not been found missing. Naruto grumped as he closed the folder and sat it back on her desk. So we're dealing with a stupid petty thief. Tsunade frowned then shrugged her shoulders. That is what you are going to find out. The problem before you ask is the local militia can't seem to catch the culprit. Whoever it is enters without disturbing anything, then departs the same way. The only hint they got at all was a piece of torn and tattered cloth. Tsunade reached into her desk and pulled out a plastic bag, and Naruto looked at the material inside as she handed it to him. Whoever it was very dirty. The cloth looked like it had been dragged through the dirt. It appeared it used to be a tan color, but Naruto couldn't tell because of all the dirt. With a shrug he tossed it on the desk on top of the folder. Okay, I'll go talk to the old man and see if he has any leads. Is there any time limit on this or is it until it's solved? Tsunade frowned as she thought about it then shrugged. I'm assuming they would like it finished as soon as possible, but I want daily updates on your progress and your discoveries. Leave as soon as possible, no later than tomorrow first light. Naruto nodded as he hopped up out of the chair but stopped at the door and looked back at Tsunade who waggled a finger at him. Don't let me down Naruto, remember do not engage hostiles. Naruto grinned as he gave her a salute as he walked out of the office. Don't worry Tsunade-bachan, I've got it all under control. He said just before stepping in the wastebasket and tripping himself, knocked Shizune over as she was about to walk into her mentor's office, scattering papers everywhere. Tsunade just put her head in her hand and grumbled. That's what I'm afraid of. Oh. Naruto jogged down to the shopping district, a grin on his face despite the mission parameters he was going to be forced to follow, but at least it was a higher rank than C. Truthfully, Naruto had gotten spoiled. After learning his parentage, moving into the Namikaze estate, and doing mostly A and B rank missions, going back to C or Shutter's D rank would be like a punishment. There had been so many changes in his life in such a short period, turning 16, being recognized by the village as a strong ninja and the last surviving heir of the Namikaze as well as the Uzumaki clans, even the Kyuubi settling down and talking to him like he was human. Good but weird changes. Unfortunately, there was also pain that he tried not to think about. Loss of comrades, Asuma, Lee, Shino, but the one that hurt the most was Hinata. Telling him she loved him almost destroyed him when he finally beat pain, and he held her in his arms, pouring all of his sorrow into her still form. Hoping, and wishing that there was still a spark of life in her, to no avail. At the time, no one could get near them. Naruto in his grief had gone completely feral, and anyone that came near them had a choice, die by Naruto's hands, or leave them the hell alone. He remained there holding her for 18 hours, and not even the Hokage could get close enough to him, until the most unlikely person was the one that broke through to the grieving boy. Hiashi Hyuga actually stood next to Naruto, talking to him in a quiet but insistent voice, and eventually rested his hand on Naruto's shoulder. After a few minutes of everyone just staring in surprise, Naruto nodded, and with tears still in his eyes, stood and carried Hinata's broken body towards the remainder of the Hyuga estates, Hiashi leading him with a hand still on his shoulder. Both men, with heads down as the weight of the world settled across their shoulders. Konoha was rebuilt, was actually still being rebuilt, and life moved on as if none of it ever happened. But Naruto remembered, he would always remember. I hate to break up this little stroll down memory lane, but weren't you going to buy something from that shop we just passed? Naruto blinked at the fox's interruption then looked back and nodded. Yeah. Naruto didn't say much else, he and the fox had an understanding of sorts. That all happened after the fox had to change certain aspects inside of Naruto. If he hadn't, Naruto's body would have burned up, literally when he went 8 tails against pain. Thus far, nothing had changed other than his ability to use a massive amount of the fox's chakra, well his strength, dexterity, and chakra reserve shot up too, but he was worried about more obvious physical changes. While he was more in click with the majority of the village, there was still the occasional holdout that refused to let go of the past. He didn't need another reason for the idiots to hate him. Fortunately, the fox told him nothing like that would happen until a certain set of stimulus was present. When asked, the fox merely shrugged. Since the chance of it happening are slim and none, I wouldn't worry about it. After a few more attempts at that information failed to produce results, Naruto filed it in the back of his mind under, unimportant, and left it at that. Standing in the weapon shop now, Naruto grinned as he saw Tenten behind the counter. Hey Ten, got the goods? Tenten looked up and grinned at Naruto before putting a bag on the counter. Of course. Naruto grinned as he looked in the bag before dropping some bills on the counter in pleasure, but a nudge from his resident made him turn and look at the wall behind the counter. At his glance, Tenten looked too then frowned. Naruto, don't tell me you're into that stuff. Naruto's attention was focused on one item in particular. A leather collar, with metal studs all along the outside, ending in an overlapping piece with a metal ring in it. Naruto reached out and grabbed the collar and looked at it curiously before looking inward and having a quick conference with his prisoner. Okay, this caught your attention, why would I want it? The Kyuubi chuckled softly as the red eyes glittered. It amuses me. In time I am sure you will find a use for it, and the leash, and a lock. Naruto had learned not to argue with the fox, he had helped him quite a bit in the past. Without argument, Naruto pulled the leash next to it down as well, and looked at Tenten. Ahem, do you have a lock for this? Tenten gave Naruto the fisheye before she reached under the counter and pulled out a lock that would fit the small metal ring before saying to him in a quieter voice. Maybe you should get out more Naruto. Being cooped up in that mansion all by yourself all of the time can't be good for you, she almost whispered. Tenten knew about all the latest things, especially on the questionable side of life, but Naruto just didn't fit the personality type to her, but as they say, it was always the quiet ones, although Naruto wasn't very quiet in his youth. Naruto grumbled at her as he took the items in his bag, threw some more money on the counter, and fled the store before any awkward questions could be asked. After a quick pack of clothes and necessities, Naruto got on his way to Wave, wondering still why the damn fox asked him to buy a collar of all things. He didn't own a dog. He didn't even want a dog. The Kyuubi snickered in his mind as this thought passed him. Oh, Naruto's arrival in Wave was without fanfare, until he got to old man Tazuna's house, that is. Inari and Tsunami broke into tears and hugged Naruto until he thought they were a part of him. Tsunami kept pulling back and looking at him, while Inari kept slapping him on the back in between hugs. Naruto grinned and put up with it until it was out of their system. He hadn't seen them in quite some time and he wouldn't begrudge them, and he wanted to catch up with them too. The day waned, and eventually Tazuna came home and the greeting and excitement started again until it was time to eat. After supper, Tazuna settled down to the business of why they called for Konoha's aid. Honestly Naruto, he began. No one has been attacked, and there has been no damage to any of the houses that have been burglarized. It just seems a little odd. I wouldn't even say it a burglary if it only happened once or twice. People misplace and lose things all of the time, but 11 houses. That is just too much to be coincidence. Naruto thought for a moment before he looked up. And nothing of substantial value has been taken. Tazuna shrugged as he took a sip of coffee. Nothing substantial that has been reported. It's just odd as hell. With a look of surprise, he pulled out a list and map and pointed to the areas that were marked with XS. Before I forget, here, these are the houses that have been burglarized, and where they are located. The list is the items that have been taken. I didn't put on there food, because that is sort of self-explanatory. Naruto smirked as he looked at the list then laughed. Seriously? This is all junk, Naruto said with obvious incredulity in his voice. Who would want this stuff? A broken picture frame, a box of Christmas ornaments, a blue foam ball. What is someone trying to do? You know, this stuff is so odd I can't even think of some crazy way to describe it, it's so nutso. Tsunami laughed from the sink where she was doing the dishes while Tazuna chuckled. Agreed, but we would like it stopped just in case the person doing it is testing our defenses for something bigger. Naruto thought about that for a second then nodded. You're right, that could be a possibility. After a couple of seconds Naruto got up and stretched before leaning down and pointing at the map. Well, according to the houses and where they were hit, I'd say our odd thief will strike here next, and according to the pattern, I'm thinking sometime tomorrow. Tazuna nodded as he leaned back in his chair. That's the way the pattern looks. Anything you need to help you? Naruto shook his head as he looked at the map one last time. No, I think I have everything I need, just keep everyone away from that house tomorrow. Tazuna nodded as he folded the map and list up again. Already taken care of since we had the same conclusions. We didn't want anyone in the area in case this person or people are dangerous. Naruto nodded as he yawned before he reached up and scratched the back of his head sheepishly. Sorry. Long run here, wore me out I guess. Tazuna chuckled then waved it off. Whatever brat, you got the same room as last time. Just make sure you are careful out there tomorrow. We would hate to lose our national hero, then we would have to rename the bridge. Before Naruto could say anything, a soapy sponge smacked Tazuna in the neck courtesy of Tsunami. Naruto laughed before he mounted the stairs as the man's daughter began to rant at her father about teasing Naruto, like she would let him rename the bridge. Oh, Naruto grumbled slightly as he sat atop the roof of the house. He had been here since 5 am, and still there was no sign of trouble or intrusion. He had expanded his senses, and waited patiently, but so far other than a rabbit there was nothing in the area that made him think twice or blink. He wondered quietly why he felt nervous. Something seemed to be making him feel jumpy and he was having a hard time remaining calm. Damn fox didn't help any either. You need to get laid boy, once you clean your pipes once or twice in a willing, or even better unwilling female, you'll be good to go I say. Naruto grumbled internally but didn't comment. There might be something to what the fox was saying though, he had never had. Sadly he knew more about it because of Ero Sanin's teachings, but he still hadn't had any with anyone. He just didn't have the nerve he guessed. The very thought of it, while giving him a massive hard-on at times, embarrassed the bejesus out of him. One of the problems was his head had been so full of crap when he was younger, and then his earnest discussions with Jiraiya during his 3-year hiatus only confused him more, and to be honest, Naruto had a traditionalist point of view. He thought was only for married people or at least people that were promised to each other. Unfortunately, Naruto was of the mind that he would never be promised to anyone, so in all likelihood he would never be married and at this rate never have. Of course there were other alternatives. Ero Sanin did try and hook him up with a hooker once, but all Naruto did was lay there and talk to her. She didn't care, she was paid for the hour and she made sure he got his full hour, but the only physical thing that happened was her hugging him at the end of the session. Still, Naruto wondered a few times what it would have been like. A slight pinging feeling in his right ear made him stop and look in that direction. Curbing his excitement, because it might have been just another rabbit looking for food, Naruto waited patiently until he saw a bush rustle ever so slightly before it stopped again. With a frown, Naruto held very still and waited, breathing shallow as a figure stepped out of the bush. Lithe-looking, with straight brown hair that reached to mid-back, Naruto wondered at the gender. It looked like it could have been male or female at this point, and Naruto was still holding his position until he blinked in surprise and the Kyuubi perked up noticeably. Naruto frowned as he took a deep breath as he saw the appendage curl behind the figure, then seemed to wag. Naruto blinked again, then using a minor jutsu enhanced his vision to see the figure clearly and froze in shock as the Kyuubi seemed to laugh in pleasure. The figure had triangular points on the top of its head that seemed to swivel back and forth as it crept forward, but the appendage behind it was the most obvious as it would curl then wag as the figure got closer to the house. It was a tail. Naruto turned inward, the most obvious question on his mind, and the Kyuubi laughed again before it made its thoughts known. Most excellent. Boy, look at that figure again, then smell it using my nose. Naruto frowned but then did as he was told, and almost fell off the roof as he was suddenly overcome with a powerful need. His nerves got even more jittery than before, and his hands curled into fists as he fought for control, just as he began to see red, and got the most painful erection he ever could remember in his life. Turning inward with some difficulty, Naruto screamed at his captive. What's happening to me? The Kyuubi merely laughed again as he nodded to the image of the figure below them and growled in pleasure. Your body is finally waking up. Be happy, a whole new world is about to open up for you. Oh, I suggest you not fight it. It isn't something that you can turn off now that it is awake. Naruto looked up at the Kyuubi and growled back in return. What is it? The Fox Lord laughed as his tails waved behind him in excitement. This, my young kid, is the mating drive. When you come within range of a female in heat, you will feel the quickening, your blood will boil, your heart will pound, and your mind will turn a page without you if you do not go with it. Be warned though, she will not give it to you the first time willingly, she will fight, and you will have to subdue her. Oh, how I wish I was in your place. Naruto blinked as his fangs began to elongate, and his fingernails grew into claws of their own accord. But I'm not a rapist. I've never even had. The Kyuubi shook his head, but it was without pity. It doesn't matter. This is one of the changes I told you about, but I never expected it to happen because a fertile female would never be around you, now there obviously is one. Blinking as he doubled over in what seemed like pain, Naruto screamed at his captive. But I've been around women all the time. This has never happened before. The Kitsune Lord only laughed again as he began to pace in front of the door to his confinement. Wrong. You have only been around human women. Now if you had encountered another demon or a Hanyu, then you of course would be going through this earlier. Why do you think I told you it was unlikely to happen? Naruto shuddered visibly as he was physically trying to stop himself from stepping forward. No, I can't do it, I won't. I won't rape her. The Myobu growled and the words only filled Naruto with dread. You have no choice. When the time comes, a Hanyu must mate. If you don't, you will die, it is part of the cycle. All demons experience it. If it soothes your hurt feelings, this isn't rape. You and she are Hanyu, half demons, and this is the normal part of the mating cycle. This is demon courtship, if you will. You find a suitable female that entices your senses, you challenge her, and then if you are victorious, to the victor the spoils. Now, go. Capture her. Make her yours, you have no choice. Against his will, Naruto nodded, then sprung down off the roof at the woman below him, colliding with her bodily. With a yelp she rolled with him, then sprang to her feet in front of him as he rolled to his. The woman, because he could now clearly see the shape of her, sniffed the air twice near Naruto, then bared her fangs to him, growling and snarling. If Naruto had been in a clearer state of mind, he would have noted she was in a low crouch, and whenever he tried to go near her, she would turn her back away from him and back up, tail curled protectively between her legs. Naruto's nostrils flared as her scent brushed his olfactory nerves like a lover's touch, maddening him until he dove forward and grabbed her arm, but her other arm came around at an incredible speed, and clubbed him on his head. Where the hand had touched, frost formed on the side of his head, but he shook off the blow, and pulled her against him. Her teeth found his shoulder and sunk in deeply, causing him to howl in pain before he picked her up off the ground, then slammed her face first into the earth, stunning her. Naruto, catching sight of her prone form, was overcome with lust as she worked her way shakily to her knees. Huffing at her vulnerable position, and seeing what his whole body screamed for, Naruto grabbed her hips and thrust forward, but with his pants on he got absolutely nowhere. The female, not out of the fight yet, kicked back and upward, catching Naruto in the family jewels, bringing on another howl of pain from him as she scrambled away from his now prone form back into the underbrush. The QB grumbled, then screamed at him. Baka. Don't just crouch there holding your balls, your vixen is getting away. Tally ho. Growling in the back of his throat, Naruto took off after her, hot on her heels until she dove down into a hole. With no hesitation, Naruto tumbled in after her, and grabbed her leg, making her stumble and roll down into the hole until she was again laying with her back to him. Naruto, with enough presence of mind this time, tore at his pants until he was free of them, then grabbed the woman by her shoulder as she turned and leapt at him. Naruto hissed in anger as her teeth sank into his other shoulder, and now her claws also found a purchase in his flesh as they sunk into his sides, but it was for naught as Naruto pinned her to the wall, and thrust into her in one smooth stroke, practically nailing her to the wall. Her head went back, and her mouth opened in a piercing scream as they now held each other in a grip that would kill ordinary folk, but in seconds, her demeanor changed. Her eyes dropped to his and she seemed to grin as her legs wrapped around his torso, pulling him deeper into her as he grunted in pleasure. Soon, a rhythm was established as they both grunted and groaned in beast-like pleasure, neither giving the other a second of respite as the fight turned into something different. Naruto felt his mind coming slowly down from the bloodlust he was feeling, and the woman in front of him latched her teeth onto his throat, but did not pierce the skin as she tongued and sucked on his exposed flesh, now purring in deep pleasure before she started yelping at each thrust. Naruto grasped her hips and began to drive her down as he thrust up, and soon she howled in ecstasy, and Naruto could feel the orgasm rippling through her until his own climax triggered in him, leaving them both breathless and mostly spent from something it seemed neither understood. Naruto slowly collapsed to the ground with the woman on top of him, who purred happily, her tail every now and then flicking into the air for absolutely no reason, before settling against his leg again. Feeling a light scratchy feeling against his neck, Naruto moved his eyes downward and could see the female now lying content against him, licking along his jawline. As if sensing him looking at her, she opened her eyes and smiled at him, with a purr coming from her throat. It took a couple of seconds, but he suddenly sat up, taking her shoulders in his hands and looked closely at her. She blinked in surprise at first, ears flicking back against her head, but stayed still as he stared at her intently. Naruto, a deep frown of shock and surprise, could barely hear his voice as he whispered to her. Haku. The woman merely smiled at him again before she buried her head in his chest, nuzzling with obvious affection, arms going around him as she in turn whispered, "Master." Before he could say anything else, she purred again with a content sigh. Oh. Naruto was unsure how long he lay there holding her, but after some time, he looked around and saw what looked like Christmas ornaments, food, and against the wall was the missing broken picture frame, and a savage blue foam ball. Naruto didn't know what to make of it, but he was sure of one thing: if this was indeed Haku, she had changed. It wasn't the same girl he met all those years ago. Looking down at her now, he could see the clothing matched the piece they received with the mission brief, and it looked like it was the same clothes they had buried her in, but how was it possible that she was alive, and living here in this warren? Naruto tried to get up, but he was still inside of her, and she refused to let go. He tried to gently push her aside, but she had a death grip on his chest, and whined when he tried to push her off. Grumbling to himself, he stood up with the help of the wall and looked more around the cave. From the piles of trash and small animal bones, she had been here for some time. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but she definitely looked like Haku, and her voice sounded like Haku's despite the purring. After a few seconds though, Naruto began to feel dizzy. Shaking his head as he leaned back against the wall again, Naruto began to feel the fire building inside of him and his manhood stiffened. Quickly turning inward, Naruto began to get frantic. What? Again? How am I supposed to sleep if this keeps happening? The Kyuubi snickered. Well, that is a problem. She is still in heat, and your body can sense it. Your drive will keep kicking in until you have sated her body's need to mate. Naruto frowned deeply as she began to move against him, light moans coming from her parted lips. How long will that take? The Fox Lord seemed to take on the look of someone in deep thought, or severe constipation. Usually, a demon's heat will only last a few days if she does not get sated. Since we don't know how long she has been in heat, I can't really say. As I see it, you have three choices: knock her up, tie her up, or ride the storm until it passes. Naruto began thinking and wondered if he could reach his ninja pouch to grab the capture wire. Sadly, the damn fox had other ideas. I wouldn't choose the tie her up option. Remember, you have to sat your desires also, or you will go into bloodlust, although we should probably call this lust. Either way, if you try to ignore the mating drive, it won't be good for you, unless you like the idea of banging every woman that gets near you until you can satisfy an urge that only one person could satisfy and you left her tied up somewhere. Naruto growled as he began to match Haku's rhythm, and the sounds of passion filled the warren once more. So what you're saying is, even though we have already done it, we have to keep doing it until she's happy. The Kyuubi laughed before he smirked down at Naruto. Exactly. His face contorted in fear for a second as he considered his options. I can't get her pregnant. I don't think I'm ready to be a father. The fox grinned at him. He really seemed to be enjoying Naruto's predicament. Fool. I told you previously you can control your sperm production, and wipe the living ones in your body out with a thought. At least that way you can enjoy her body until her heat passes. Naruto's eyes crossed briefly when he felt Haku tighten up around him, before he performed the trick the Kyuubi had taught him months ago. Feeling the red rush of the fox's chakra going through his body, Naruto hoped it worked as he grumbled inside himself, but on the outside began panting as he thrust harder and harder into Haku, who had started yelping in pleasure once more. Naruto watched her face in the throes of passion while Haku pounded her hips against him. Next, you'll tell me I have to take out the trash and cut the lawn. The fox snickered at Naruto. Well, now that you mention it. Shut up. Naruto screamed internally as he prepared to ride out the storm. Oh. Naruto woke up with a splitting headache, and his hurt. He wasn't sure what that meant. Maybe he fell on his tailbone at some point. Naruto reached back to scratch his butt, and at the same time his other hand went up to rub his head, and screamed like a woman as soon as he touched them. His hand kept patting his head where he kept touching something that kept twitching, and something was stuck in his pants and under his jacket as well. Naruto undid the remainder of his pants and reached back to discover the one thing he hadn't thought of. He now had a tail. And his ears felt funny to him, like they were numb. Naruto reached to the sides of his head and felt for his ears, and they were still there, but it was like they weren't working. His hearing was more enhanced, it seems, but he was sure it was due to the new ears atop his head. Without thinking about it, Naruto's tail waved behind him a few times, and with some effort he was able to figure out how to swivel in different direction. It took a bit, but he realized his feet felt uncomfortable in the sandals. Bending down, and smacking himself in the face with his tail a few times, Naruto took off his sandals and blinked at his feet. They looked strange to say the least. They looked more slender in the middle, and when he pulled the bottom of one of them to his face he noticed thick dark pads on his heel and the ball of his foot as well as his toes. Surprisingly, he also had thick but very soft hair on his calves, parts of his arms, and of course the hair on his head felt different. In the low light he looked at it, and was happy that it was all still blonde. he was just hairier than he was, or in this case furrier. Surprisingly, Naruto remained calm and turned inward to his unwilling companion. Okay, I think it's time you explain all of this. The fox grumped at him before opening his eyes and staring at him. What's to explain? You're a Hanyu. Go your mate, raise kits and enjoy. The fox tried to close its eyes, but Naruto reached through the bars and grabbed one of the great lids and held it up. Oh number. I don't think so, Fluffy. You start explaining right now, or are you no better than the villagers who left me uneducated most of my young life? Naruto just barely pulled his arm back out of the bars as the fox lord's mouth snapped at him. Don't presume to call me something so insulting again. I have been one of the only sources of help that you have had. Naruto chuckled, then shrugged. Then be a little more helpful. You did this to me, you can at least explain it to me, and tell me how Haku is still alive. The Myobu huffed at him before grumping and turning his eyes in Naruto's direction again. Very well. All that I have told you already is true and mostly complete. You have already gotten all the benefits of being a Hanyu, you just hadn't gotten the looks. Since there was no suitable female near for you, it was likely that you never would have developed the traits. As far as your mate goes, that I cannot explain. It is possible that when you buried her, you unwittingly poured enough of my chakra into her that it started a slow regenerative process. It's also likely Kami farted in your mouth while you slept, and the magic puff fairies kicked their feet, shook there and made it happen. Who cares? Naruto almost laughed at the last part, but Haku scrambling back into the burrow made him stop. Under her arm, she had what looked like a rabbit. With a smile she dropped it at Naruto's feet before she prostrated herself to him, forehead to the floor, and quietly acknowledged him. Master. She purred out, her tail waving back and forth in what Naruto assumed was happiness. Naruto, not sure what to do, dropped down in front of her, and raised her up by her shoulders to look at her face. Her eyes were big as she looked at him, wondering what he would do, and Naruto had so many questions for her. Haku, where have you been? What happened to you? Haku's head at him before she smiled. Master. Naruto blinked before tried again. Do you understand me? Haku frowned for a second before she smiled again. Master. Now Naruto looked inward. What's the deal? She acts like she can't say anything else. The Myobu frowned as he considered. Touch your forehead to hers. He commanded softly. Naruto shrugged, then leaned forward, making contact with her head. Naruto felt the red chakra slip from him as Haku began to purr, and a few seconds later the Kyuubi grunted. It appears she is a clean slate. Naruto blinked. Pardon me. The Myobu frowned before he sat up. There is nothing there. I am surprised she was able to call you master, perhaps it was instinctual. In any case, there are no memories there. Her mind is empty. She seems to be acting basically on instinct. It's a good thing no one has discovered her burrow, or they might have found themselves in a world of trouble. Naruto leaned back and looked at Haku, who studied him curiously as he spoke to his captive. So you're saying, oh come on, you aren't that stupid. She is the perfect submissive. She will already be unquestioningly loyal to you, but you can virtually make her into anything. You can restore her by teaching her, but the girl you knew as Haku is gone. Naruto frowned down at her, causing her to shrink back, ears laying flat against her head, but when he reached over and rubbed her head behind her ears, she began to purr again and relaxed with her eyes closed. Naruto thought for a few minutes about this situation. Haku was gone, but she was here. At least physically. Naruto wondered what life would have been like if Haku hadn't died. For a few seconds his mind began to spin a daydream for him. Him and Haku eating at Ichiraku together, training together, maybe even falling in love and getting married. After a few seconds, a small smile came to his face as he looked down at her again. What the hell? He said quietly before he knelt in front of Haku. She watched him curiously until he touched her chest between her with his index finger. Haku, he said firmly. Haku looked at him strangely for a minute or so until he did it again. Haku, not sure what he wanted, she touched her chest and repeated the word. Haku, her dulcet voice whispered. Naruto nodded happily, until she picked up the rabbit and held it to him. Haku, shaking his head, he took the rabbit and put it on the floor again. No, he again touched her and said it. Haku, before he touched his chest and smiled at her. Naruto. She frowned as she looked at him before shaking her head. Naruto tried it again until he got the same result from her. With a grump, he thumped himself on the chest. Naruto, he said a little more forcefully than he intended. Haku's eyes began to look moist and he wondered what was wrong until she touched his chest and whispered. Master. Naruto frowned, but before he could say anything, the fox butted in. This is the bonding process. If she calls you master, there is a reason. Naruto frowned at the fox in frustration. But I'm not her master. The fox shook his head before he growled at Naruto. Yes, you are. She is bound to you as your mate. She acknowledges you as her alpha, the master. Since she is the first, she is your alpha. If you take another female, she will be the beta female in your life, in all intents and purposes, just like this one, but submissive to the alpha female as well. Accept reality as it is, unless you really want to watch her die again because you rejected her. Naruto frowned as he looked at Haku again, and he could see she was trembling now, and the tears were actually rolling out of her eyes and down her face. Wait, why would she die? The Fox Lord sighed as he leaned closer to Naruto. You are dense, aren't you? She is bound to you, and Myobu mate for life. You are not a Myobu, but you are a Hanyu, and it relates the same. Granted, since you are a Hanyu, I dare say you could dump her, but then she would pine for you, not eating or drinking, not caring about anything until you return for her, or she died. When you die, she will also. It is the way of things, so choose. Accept her, or know that you could have had someone precious to you come back for a second chance, and you let her die, or simply put, you killed her. Naruto frowned inward, but soon stared at Haku again, who was openly weeping now. The one thing that Naruto had trouble with was tears. Especially someone he cared about. Reaching down, Naruto took her hand and put it on his chest again, surprising her before he smiled at her. Master, he said quietly. Haku's sad face broke into a grin as her hand pressed against his chest harder. Master, she said with a hopeful expression, and Naruto could only smile goofily at her and nod. Yes, Haku, master. At which point she yipped happily, and tackled him. Naruto wasn't sure what would happen now as she licked his neck and he could feel himself rising to the occasion again, but he knew at least he wouldn't have to deal with it by himself. Naruto wondered how he got himself into these messes as he finally seemed to break Haku's heat. But even without her being in heat, she always seemed to be in the mood to do the deed. Naruto found this out the hard way when they were going to eat. He had made a fire which she found fascinating to look at, but wouldn't go near, so Naruto figured he would introduce her to cooked food. Well, Naruto started going around without pants on since they were completely ruined now anyway, and what happened surprised as well as shocked him. Haku had crawled over to him in a way, which he recognized it for what it was now but didn't at the time, and grabbed him. Now normally, this would probably not be a bad thing, but he was trying to cook, and he tried to focus on that, but when he felt her scratchy tongue treating him like a growing ice pop, all bets were off. Naruto had never received oral pleasure before, or any other kind of pleasure for that matter, unless you count Sakura beating his head in regularly, so try as he might, he just couldn't resist. In all honesty, what guy would? The Kyuubi, damn him, had gone to sleep and refused to wake up, so Naruto was almost literally on his own. He did his best, but he wasn't sure what he was doing wrong as he ran into another new mate problem. Not sure of how much time had passed, Naruto crawled out of the burrow and blinked at the sun. He had been down there so long, his eyes needed to adjust to the light again. Looking around, he realized Haku was still in the burrow. Naruto called to her a few times and waited. When she didn't come out, he made a face then climbed back down into the burrow, to find her shivering and crying. Naruto in shock, knelt down and hugged her. What's wrong, Haku? She looked into his eyes and touched his chest. Master. Naruto nodded and smiled at her in concern. Yes, Master. Haku smiled a little before she looked at the opening leading out of the burrow. Naruto moved to the exit, but her whine made him look at her. Her face was full of sorrow and he went back over to her and placed his hands on her shoulders. Haku, what's wrong? From inside his head, Naruto heard a voice grumble at him. Call her stupid. Naruto blinked in surprise before he looked inward. What are you talking about? The fox yawned, showing all of his teeth before he closed his mouth with a click. I said collar her. She won't leave the burrow without some symbol of your dominance over her. Naruto frowned before he shook his head at the fox. Ah, that's tiger shit. She's been bringing food back for us every day, however long it's been. He said as he scratched his head in confusion. The fox growled at him before Naruto could speak again. Yes, she has, but that was different. She was doing her duty and bringing nourishment for you and her. Now you have to provide reassurance, if you will, that you are not abandoning her. She can probably sense your intention to leave, and since this has been her home, she needs to feel secure. Lock the collar around her neck, and if she still resists, use the leash. Once you have her in your permanent home, she will mark it, and then go about her normal routine, and this will not happen again. Naruto frowned at this, and to be honest, he didn't understand the whole marking it thing, but if putting the collar on her would make her come along, he was all for it. Looking for his tattered pants, Naruto pulled out one of the storage scrolls he brought with him, and invoked it. When it had disgorged its contents, Naruto looked through the pile until he found the collar and lock. Turning to her, he was surprised to see a look of anticipation in her eyes. Feeling like some kind of pervert, Naruto wrapped the collar around her throat and was surprised how well it fit her before he locked the collar in place. Haku moved her head around and twisted her neck a few times before she settled down with a smile on her face. Sighing in relief, Naruto dug out the leash and put it in the pocket of the remains of his jacket in case he needed it, and put on the spare set of pants he brought with him. Immediately he noticed, the pants seemed to make him feel uncomfortable, but he shrugged it off for the time being. Haku quirked her eyes at him in curiosity as he did this, but made no move to stop him. She of course was almost completely, except for the tattered battle kimono they buried her in originally. Packing the scroll again, Naruto crawled up and out the entrance. This time, however, when he called Haku, she came scrambling up from the burrow and crouched next to him. Naruto couldn't help but smirk down at her before he turned and began walking back to where Tazuna lived, Haku close to him, not leaving his side. Oh, when Naruto arrived, he took a deep breath and sighed. It would be nice to use a toilet again, and a good hot bath. When he stepped out in the open, however, Haku would not. Naruto called to her, but she stayed crouched there in the bushes. Feeling frustrated, Naruto walked over and hooked the leash to the collar and gave it a little tug. She looked up at him, and he smiled gently at her and tugged the leash again. With only a slight hesitation, she came cautiously forward out of the bushes, following Naruto until they stood at the door to the house. With a deep breath and a feeling of dread, he knocked on the door. After a few seconds, the door opened and Inari gaped at Naruto and the mostly Haku. Wah! Naruto, who, mom? The boy yelled, causing Naruto and Haku both to wince, ears folding back on their heads. It took a little longer, but Tsunami came to the door to see what Inari was frantic about and stopped dead in her tracks too. Naruto chuckled for a second, then rubbed the back of his head as his ears twitched towards her. Have I got a story for you? Tsunami shook her head, then opened the door wider for them to come in. I'm all ears, she said before she thought, only Naruto. Oh, Tsunami frowned as she sipped her tea, but kept her eyes on Naruto and Haku, who crouched next to him. Haku's ears kept flicking back to the conversation between Tsunami and Naruto, but her eyes were everywhere else. So she's like a wild animal then? Naruto winced at the comparison but nodded. Yeah, the thing is I can't leave her, she would die without me, and to be honest, I'm starting to grow attached to her. Tsunami blinked, then smiled slyly at him, which made him blush. So it wouldn't be because of some extracurricular activity, would it? Naruto frowned at the word, then Tsunami laughed before she sipped from her cup again. Never mind, Naruto-kun. Well, at least you were able to solve the mystery, so you'll be taking her back to Konoha then? Naruto sighed as he considered his options, then nodded. Yeah, I'm sure I'll really hear it from Bachan when I get, and Naruto went as pale as paper as his mouth opened and closed a few times. Tsunami, not sure what was wrong, stood up and went over to him. Naruto. Naruto began to stammer, and then Tsunami understood as he said one sentence. Bachan is gonna kill me. Looking at her quickly, he almost shouted, How long have I been gone? Tsunami blinked in surprise. 4 days, why? Naruto began to sweat bullets as he ran over to a drawer and pulled out paper and pen and began scribbling at a mad pace. Running outside, he bit his thumb and screamed out, summoning jutsu. In a puff of smoke, Gamakichi appeared. Naruto, you look frantic. What's up? Naruto handed him the paper. Take this to Tsunade Bachan as fast as you can, please. Gamakichi, seeing how desperate Naruto looked, didn't even argue or ask for a reward. He puffed into smoke and Naruto collapsed to his knees. Maybe she'll only just maim me now. Tsunami's scream made him jump before he turned and ran back into the house, claws bared. What? Where is it? What is it? Tsunami pointed to the corner of the room, where a steaming pile of human excrement now rested. Naruto blinked, then looked at Haku, who just stared back at him with a smile. Master. Naruto frowned as Tsunami handed him a roll of paper towels before he mumbled, obviously not housebroken. With a sigh, he went and began to clean the mess. Could it get worse? He asked himself. He should have known better. Oh, it didn't take Gamakichi long to return with a response and the bad news. Tsunade had sent a genin squad and their sensei to see why he hadn't reported. They would be there in 2 days, and when he got back she wanted a full explanation. Naruto whined as he read the note and worried over who would be showing up. After promising to get Gamakichi a bag of candy, Naruto asked if he could use the shower. Tsunami agreed readily, and Naruto went upstairs and stripped the remainder of his clothes off and hopped in, completely forgetting about his shadow. Many thoughts bounced in his head, and unfortunately they all centered around how much trouble he was or would be in when he got back. He sighed as the hot water erased some of his worries, but then wondered again who she would send. Kakashi wasn't an instructor anymore, Asuma was dead, Kurenai had retired so she could raise her son, Ebisu was killed by a jealous husband, not many Jonin he knew of that were instructors. Naruto tried not to think about it as he turned off the water and dried himself off. At least he had a few days before the hangman pulled the lever. Naruto went over to the room he occupied so long ago, and threw himself on the bed in hopes to get a few hours of much-needed rest. Of course, that didn't last. He wasn't sure what time it was, but at some point in the night Haku had come into the room with him. She crouched there staring at him for a few minutes, just observing him in sleep. She was unfamiliar with a bed, but her master looked so relaxed and she wanted to be near him. Quietly, she climbed on the bed and tried to curl up next to him. Naruto, feeling something pressed against him, scooted to the other side of the bed without even waking up. Haku then scooted closer to him to bask in his body heat and scent, when he pulled even further away. Not knowing any better, she scooted over once more, when Naruto let out a yelp, landing face first on the floor. Slowly looking up, Naruto saw Haku looking down at him curiously. "Master." Naruto frowned, as he rested his head on his hand. He tapped the floor with 4 of the fingers on his other hand as he grumbled to himself. It was going to be a long night. Oh. The next day, Naruto was outside practicing whatever came to mind, and Tsunami was working with Haku. She had told him she had some experience training animals from when she was younger, and she would see what she could do with Haku. Naruto, not one to argue with free help, agreed and let her have it. Happily he was wearing pants again as Tsunami was happy altering them so his tail fit through them, and promised to try and improvise something for Haku. At the moment all Haku had on as far as clothing goes was a tank top which fit her snugly, and nothing else. Inari surprisingly kept his eyes away from obvious areas, and said nothing to the contrary. Naruto practiced the entire day, not even stopping to eat until he came in the house. Tazuna was there, sake in hand, staring at Haku. Naruto grinned as he sat next to the man as Haku came over and hung on Naruto. "What? Never seen a girl with fox ears before." Tsunami giggled and Inari snickered as he helped his mother set the table. Tazuna finally looked at Naruto and almost jumped out of his chair. Naruto had a belly laugh at the old man's expense, then shrugged at himself. "It's a little hard to explain, but I did solve your petty theft problem." Tazuna nodded as his eyes went from Naruto to Haku then back again. "Oh, I'll just bet you did," he mumbled as his eyes kept drifting back and forth. Tazuna took a big gulp of sake as Haku, much to Naruto's pleasure, began to groom him, which felt really damn good he had to admit. Tazuna eventually just shook his head and sat at the table again. "I suppose our problem had something to do with her?" he asked with a hint of suspicion in his voice. Naruto laughed as Haku hit a ticklish spot which made her grin happily before he nodded. "Yeah, but she meant no harm. I guess she was lonely and wanted something to entertain her, otherwise there isn't anything to worry about from her," he said as she started rubbing her face against his chest and shoulder. After a few more minutes of table banter, Tsunami filled all of their bowls with stew that tasted remarkably good. Naruto enjoyed the taste, but blinked as he felt a tug on his pants. Looking down, Haku handed him her bowl which she had taken under the table with her, which was now empty. Naruto tilted the bowl over and nothing, not even a drop came out. "She, seems to have your appetite, Naruto," Inari said in surprise. Naruto could only nod. Haku then tugged insistently at his pants leg and he looked down at her again. "What is it, Haku?" She looked at him, her eyes almost pleading. "Master," she said to him, an urgent edge to her voice. Naruto looked at Tsunami and she frowned for a second, then it came to her. "Oh, she just ate so she probably has to go out." Naruto blinked before he shook his head. "What?" Tsunami sighed as she pointed to the front door. "She just ate. She probably has to go to the bathroom, and if she does it on the floor again you are going to ruin all the hard work we did today," Tsunami said with a slight edge to her voice. Naruto got the message and stumbled from his chair with Haku hot on his heels. As soon as Naruto had the door open, she charged out and into the bushes. Naruto almost laughed aloud, but realized this was not bad. At least he wouldn't be cleaning the rugs over and over again in his house. Tsunami spoke from behind him. It didn't take her long to learn that, with a good teacher, we could get her to live and act mostly normal. I almost have her using the toilet, but I think the appearance bothers her. Naruto nodded as Haku came trotting back and stopped in front of him looking relieved. Naruto smiled at her before rubbing her head. She should be fine once we get back to Konoha. She'll live with me, and hopefully there won't be any problems from the villagers. Tsunami nodded as she looked at him. If there is, you could always come here, you know everyone here would welcome you. Naruto smiled happily at Tsunami, so didn't notice the light touch on his pants until they were at his ankles. Naruto blinked then gasped when he felt a hot, wet mouth around his most sensitive organ. Tsunami blushed scarlet and averted her eyes. But you will definitely have to work on that, she said as she went back in the house after pushing him out onto the porch and closing the door harder than she probably wanted to. Naruto hoped they wouldn't make too much noise. Oh, the next day, Naruto grumbled about early mornings as he climbed from the bed, and Haku awoke as he moved away from her. Naruto was sure Tsunami wanted to kill him now. Haku wouldn't stop until he had hammered her at least 3 times, and vocal wasn't even a good way to describe it. She wasn't in heat, but man was she loud. Naruto wondered if it was because he was trying to be quiet, or if she really was that loud. When he got downstairs and saw the glares from Tsunami and Inari who had bags under their eyes, and the look of admiration on Tazuna, he nodded sheepishly as he blushed. I guess we were that loud, he thought to himself. Sorry. Inari after a few seconds laughed. You're lucky you stopped when you did. Mom was gonna throw a pot of scalding hot water to separate you guys. Naruto's ears flattened against his head as he looked at Tsunami, eyes bigger than saucers. Huh, that wouldn't be right. Tsunami glared at her son. Inari, don't fib. Inari put his head down but Tsunami mumbled, it wasn't that hot. Naruto sighed as he nodded. They had worn out their welcome. We'll be gone as soon as the others get here, he said rather glumly. Tazuna cleared his throat and looked at Tsunami a little sternly. I seem to remember a young woman and man who made almost as much noise every night in this house. Kept me awake all the time, but I turned a blind eye to it even though I could still hear them. I wonder who else remembers how loud they were. Tsunami blushed so dark she almost looked purple before she sighed, came over and kissed Naruto between his ears. Gomen Naruto-kun, I'm just grumpy because I'm tired. Naruto nodded but said nothing else as Haku came into the kitchen and got cozy up against Naruto, rubbing her face against his shoulder and neck. Master. Naruto sighed and began rubbing Haku behind her ears, making her squirm against him and purr. Well, I will practice some more before the Konoha nins get here. He paused as he looked at Tsunami. Will you help Haku some more, please? I know you are upset with us after last night, but I would really appreciate it, Tsunami. Tsunami turned around and bounced a wet sponge off of Naruto's head. Dum-dum. Of course I'm going to help you, and stop pouting. You should know me better by now. Naruto blinked sheepishly before he kissed Haku on her lips. Behave, Haku, he said as he got up and went outside. Haku just watched him go, then settled into a crouch and waited for Tsunami. Oh, Naruto sighed as he grabbed a towel and wiped himself off. Standing with just his pants on, he had worked up a sweat and felt good as he stretched before going on to his next step. Before he got started, however, a familiar voice called to him. He turned and sure enough, it was the pink-haired banshee with 3 genin in tow. None of them looked happy about being there, but Sakura had a smile on her face at the very least, until she got closer and a good look at him. She was running but slowed to a walk before she reached him, shock clearly evident on her face. Naruto. Naruto nodded before he rubbed the back of his head and gave her a big goofy smile. Yeah, it's a long story, but it's me. Sakura grumped at him but nodded. Yeah, okay. Are you okay? Lady Tsunade said you were late to report and so she sent us to check on you. Naruto nodded as he looked to Tazuna's house. Yeah, the changes and a few other discoveries kept me a little too busy too, Naruto said as a familiar woman's voice came to him. Master! Master! Haku shouted as she ran towards him on all fours. Looking over, Sakura's genin team gawked, and Sakura's eyes bugged out. Naruto palmed his face as he knew this was probably going to hurt. Haku barreled into Naruto, knocking him to the ground, and she quickly straddled his waist as he tried to catch his breath from her collision. Sakura frowned as she looked at the two but then glared as the girl sat up. Master, dress, she said as she pointed to the garment she now wore, making Naruto nod and smile. It was a pretty yellow summer dress with white lace. Yes, Haku, very good, you're wearing a dress. The next thing she did though made Sakura glare at him as he got an erection. Haku lifted the front of her dress and pointed to the black bikini underwear she had on. Master, panties. Naruto blushed a little then nodded before his eyes shot towards a pink-haired monster that was now looming over him. Naruto. You pervert. She screamed as she reached down pulled Naruto up by his tattered jacket, then punched him hard enough to leave an imprint of himself on the nearest tree. Sakura, as always in her anger, failed to ask Naruto some very important questions like, who is she, and why is she showing you her panties? Or else she wouldn't have hurt Naruto, and wouldn't have gotten hurt. Hearing a low growl, Sakura turned, just as she got a fist to her stomach doubling her over. Before she could catch her breath, another fist connected with her jaw in a massive uppercut that lay Sakura on her back groaning in pain. Haku stood over Sakura snarling like an angry cat, claws and fangs bared. Sakura shook her head then looked up at the fox girl but before she could say anything, Haku pointed to Naruto and snapped at Sakura, Master. Then tapped herself on her chest. Haku Master. Sakura was still seeing stars, so could only nod her head dumbly. Naruto was just starting to pull himself from the tree, when Haku trotted over and helped him, crooning softly to him in sympathy, rubbing and fussing over him to make sure he was okay. Sakura sat up and rubbed her jaw, then pulled her hand back and saw frost on it. What was that? She mumbled as Haku began to groom Naruto, whispering, Master, in concern between licks as she examined him. Naruto blinked a few times before he turned and smiled at Haku and pat her head. I'm okay, good girl Haku. Haku her head at the new word, but the intent behind it carried through and she purred happily as she once again buried her face in his chest. The three genin now free of their stupefied reaction of Sakura being laid out rushed to her and took up fighting stances between her and Haku. The ice mistress turned fox girl dropped into a crouch in front of Naruto and growled deeply in the back of her throat. Before Haku could spring however, Naruto had her by the collar and shouted at her. No. Haku blinked and shrunk down next to him, ears laid back. Master, she said in obvious confusion, but Naruto held onto her collar and began to rub her ears gently to calm her. Looking to the three genin, Naruto pushed Haku behind him, finger still looped in her collar. I am Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, a special jonin of Konoha, now stand down. The three looked confused and looked to their sensei who still looked a little woozy, but Naruto was not going to stand by for this crap. I said stand down. Two of the genin relaxed their posture, but the third, a Hyuga, remained in the gentle fist stance as he glared at Naruto. I know who you are, Namikaze, jailer of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, and while most respect you in the village, I do not. Naruto's eyes narrowed, but before he could say anything, a hand clubbed the young Hyuga on the side of his head, knocking him from his feet. You listen to your superiors, Kane. You don't do what you want to do, which I have already told you more times than I can remember. You are on report and will answer to a disciplinary hearing when we get back. Sakura's words stung the boy as he rubbed at his head before standing up and nodding to her, eyes hard. Hi, sensei. Sakura looked at Naruto and Haku before walking over to them, but as she got closer, Haku began to growl at her. Naruto shushed her and she looked at him curiously, but then glared at Sakura. So, care trying to explain her, and why she keeps calling you master? Naruto sighed before he shrugged. It's a long story. Sakura nodded as she stood outside of arm's reach of Haku and Naruto, just in case. Well, do you want to explain now or on the way back to Konoha? Naruto looked at the house, then looked at Haku, who purred at him, then back at Sakura. Why don't we rest here for tonight? I'll give you the short and dirty version, and head back first thing in the morning, and I'll explain everything else. Sakura nodded as Naruto, still holding Haku's collar, led her back to the house. Sakura watched him go, then turned to dress down her team for their actions. Oh. The next morning, the five of them were running along the path through the forest heading back towards Konoha. Naruto had been telling Sakura of his recent adventures and his new attachment, as she kept pace with him at his side. He wasn't sure she could run through trees as they could, so they agreed to take the paths back. So let me get this straight. This, she said pointing towards Haku, is the Haku that almost killed Sasuke all those years ago. And somehow, your tenant's chakra brought her back to life, but she doesn't remember any of it, and now she is your slave. Naruto shook his head. No, she isn't my slave. According to Q, she is my mate, but she acknowledges me as her master. Sakura nodded as she looked at him skeptically. So you say, well, Naruto, you sure know how to get yourself caught up in some messes. But, that has always been you. Nothing was said for a few minutes as they continued running, until Sakura had a thought. Who's going to teach her more now that we are taking her back to Konoha? Naruto frowned before he shrugged. I hadn't thought too deeply on that yet, Sakura. It's been a crazy couple of days, and to be honest, I just want to go home and crawl in my bed and sleep. Sakura chuckled, which made Naruto look at her inquisitively. The look wasn't lost on her as she pointed to Haku again. Good luck explaining this to the Hokage. I'm sure she'll be real understanding. Naruto blanched for a moment, then looked glum as he nodded. I know, she'll probably launch me out the window, but I won't abandon Haku. It isn't her fault, and it really isn't mine. But I will do right by her because she needs me, and in a quieter voice Naruto mumbled, at least someone finally does. Sakura glanced at Naruto out of the corner of her eye and saw the sad look on his face, and she understood. Naruto had a horrible life growing up, and when Sakura later found out, she felt really bad for the way she had treated him, and how others had treated him. Of course, she hadn't changed much, but the difference between now and then was she picked on him the way a sister would, instead of the way a bully would, although some old habits still popped up now and then. Seeing how every so often Naruto would glance at Haku and smile, Sakura knew that however strange this was, Naruto might be happy, and she wouldn't deny him that. After Hinata died, Naruto had withdrawn more into himself. The mask that Sakura found out he wore became an everyday thing. He hardly ever let his guard down anymore, and while he still laughed and smiled, Sakura knew there was very little feeling behind it. There was a bigger void in him now than ever before, and she truly hoped Haku would be able to fill it. Oh, Naruto sat on the tree stump on the edge of their encampment. They would be back in Konoha in the morning and then a whole new set of worries will come to life. While Naruto mulled that over, familiar clawed fingers squeezed his shoulder, and a purr interrupted his thoughts as Haku began to groom him with long licks of her tongue. Naruto almost giggled a few times, but more than the funny feeling was the erotic feeling and he couldn't help but respond. Which in turn made Haku respond. Which in turn caused Sakura and her genin team to run willy-nilly around the camp to find Naruto and Haku, getting it on, while he was still sitting on the tree stump. Sakura glared at him, but after Tsunami warned the girl about what might happen between the two at the most inopportune times, she just turned and walked off in a huff, crawled back in her tent and wrapped the pillow around her head. Her genin team, taking their sensei's example, ran to their tents and tried to pretend they didn't see what they just did. Oh, Tsunade glared at him a few times as he sat on the couch with Haku practically draped over him. Naruto wore a goofy grin as always, even when Sakura revealed things he really didn't want his foster sister to know. You had with her in front of Sakura and her team. Naruto blushed before he put his head down, which caused Haku to lick him on his cheek insistently as she sensed the drop in his happiness. Naruto pat her head gently and she looked at him questioningly, but relaxed again when he didn't say anything. I know Bachan, but it can't be helped. When the mating drive comes, it can't be ignored. It's like, I don't know, I have to do it. There's no reason to ignore and no excuses that I can make to it. Haku is the same way. Haku looked at him and smiled. Master? She asked as she watched him. Naruto just smiled at her before pecking her on the lips. Tsunade frowned to hide the smile she got when she saw the obvious affection he showed the woman draped over him. It was possible that they would be good together. She would wait and see if things didn't progress in the wrong direction. Well, you completed the mission, despite not reporting in. I will forgive you this time, brat, but watch it. Naruto nodded before he grinned in relief. Thanks, Bachan. I'm going to take Haku to her new home after I deposit my pay. Tsunade cleared her throat and Naruto stopped and looked at her. I have something else for you to do, but it is here in the village. She said quickly to stall his protest. Naruto took a deep breath and nodded with a sigh. All right, Bachan, what do I have to do? Tsunade handed him a scroll which he opened, then blinked and looked at her after he began to read it. Tsunade grimaced, but it wasn't an angry or disappointed look, more like worry. They requested for you specifically. I would suggest you go today. I will have Shizune keep an eye on Haku, and continue educating her. Naruto nodded blankly as Haku followed him out of the office and Tsunade hoped everything would be better than what she thought they would be like. Oh. Naruto closed the gate behind them and the seals automatically fell into place as he led Haku towards the front entrance. Not knowing what to expect, he opened the door and Haku cautiously stepped in behind him, eyes darting around to take in everything, and her ears were swiveling in every direction like miniature radar dishes. When she sensed no threat, she looked at Naruto and smiled, and Naruto nodded and gestured around. Home, Haku, home. Haku's smile was big, almost a smaller version of Naruto's as she began to dart around the house inspecting everything, and every corner. Well, boy, you have done well. She will become accustomed to her new surroundings in no time. Naruto nodded as he watched Haku dart into the kitchen. Yeah, and as soon as Shizune has had a little time to work with her, she will be better able to communicate with. Maybe I should approach the Inuzukas and see if they have any ideas to speed up the process. The Kyuubi frowned at Naruto and shook his head. Why are you such a fool? If you domesticate her too much, you will have nothing but trouble. Naruto shrugged at his captive before sitting down in his mind in front of the cage. My life, my decision. Besides, I think she looks good in clothes. Kyuubi just grumbled something that sounded like, stupid human, but he wouldn't let this break his mood. Naruto smiled again as he stepped out of his mind, but after looking at the clock he realized it had been a while since he last saw Haku. Standing up and going towards the kitchen he saw a sight that worried him. Haku's dress was crumpled in a heap on the floor, but Haku wasn't in it. Picking up the dress he cautiously walked up the stairs and tried to find Haku until outside the master bedroom, he found a pair of black panties. Naruto was worried for a second as he picked them up and stepped into the bedroom. He didn't see Haku anywhere, but he heard her, and then he smelled her. Naruto came around the side of the bed and blinked at Haku in confusion. Haku was squatting down next to the bed, which wasn't strange unto itself. No, the strange part was she had her hand between her legs, and she was making quiet yelping sounds as her fingers moved furiously over her maidenhood until she moaned long and low in the back of her throat. Naruto got an erection of epic proportions as he watched the display until she caught her breath. Then she hopped on the bed, and wiped her wet hand across both the pillow and the mattress as she pulled the comforter and sheets aside. Naruto was about to say something to her, but the Kyuubi stopped him. I wouldn't. She is marking her territory. In fact, I am sure if you say nothing, she will take no notice of you until she has completely marked her areas of the house. Naruto frowned at that as he watched her go back to the side of the bed and began to rub herself furiously again. So this is marking. Odd. Kyuubi smirked at Naruto as he watched him. What did you think she would do? Pee in the corner. Naruto said nothing as he remembered Kiba talking about Akamaru when he would mark territory, and indeed that was what he thought she would do. So you're saying she is basically saying this is her house? The Fox Lord nodded as he also watched enrapt. Indeed. Anyone who has an acute sense of smell such as this or the aforementioned Inuzukas will know that this is her and your domain. Before Naruto could say anything else, the doorbell rang, and he quietly walked out of the bedroom and down to the front door. When he opened it, he saw Shizune standing there with a smile. Hello Naruto-kun, Tsunade sent me to meet this new girl of yours and to teach her. Naruto nodded as he hugged Shizune briefly. Yeah, but please don't bother her just yet, she's, marking her territory. At Shizune's confused look he explained to her the fox demon's trait and habits as he understood them. He also explained about his new features and appendages, which she brushed off as superficial. Naruto felt immensely better when she said with a smile, "You're still Naruto to me." After a few minutes Naruto called upstairs and Haku came bounding down the stairs, jumped the railing and landed at his side. Master. Naruto grinned at her acrobatics, and the cute way her face looked when she looked at him expectantly. This is Shizune, she will talk to you and teach you things, okay? Haku her head at Shizune then looked back at Naruto and he hoped she understood. I need to go Haku, stay here until I come back. Looking to say something to Shizune, he saw the deep blush on her face and realized why she was embarrassed immediately. With a smirk Naruto looked at Haku. Haku, panties, he said to her, and held out the black material to her. Interestingly enough, Haku immediately climbed into them and looked at Naruto expectantly. Naruto smiled and pat her head. Good girl Haku. Haku crouched there waiting until he walked to the door. As he opened it, Haku dashed over to him and knelt at his feet. Master. She asked with a hint of anxiety in her voice. Naruto frowned, then smiled at her before he leaned down and kissed her on her lips. Haku purred quietly as he pulled away from her. I'll be back Haku, he said with as much confidence he could pour into it. Haku then smiled as she watched him walk out the front door and down the path to the front gate. Her tail waved lazily behind her as she knew instinctively that he would be back for her. He would come home again. Oh, Naruto stood in front of the desk and wondered what the man would tell him. Hiashi hadn't talked to him since the funeral, and to be honest, Naruto hadn't wanted to return for obvious reasons. After a few minutes, Hiashi finished what he was doing and looked at Naruto. You have not come by for some time, Naruto-san, is there a specific reason? Naruto frowned as he fidgeted for a few seconds. When he finally did speak, he decided it would be best to be candid with the Hyuga Lord. It hurt me to think about it. It was not meant as an insult to you or your clan, it is just the pain from that day, and the day we laid her to rest in the mausoleum is still so fresh in my mind, and stabs me like a kunai to my heart. Hiashi nodded once curtly. The Hyuga Lord understood better than he let on. In truth, his mourning period was almost as long for Hinata as it was for his wife, and he mourned his wife's passing for a full month before he finally came back from seclusion, and even then he hadn't been able to purge all of his grief. For Hinata, Neji, Hanabi and himself mourned for almost 3 weeks before they finally came back to the main house. Naruto never got over his grief. Indeed, how do you recover from discovering that you are loved by someone, only to watch them die, and you are helpless to do anything to stop it? I understand, Naruto-san, and I do not hold any anger towards you because of it, but that isn't the real reason I asked you here. Hiashi sipped at the tea before he continued. I have noticed the changes to your appearance, and to be honest, I suspected something like this to happen eventually as you became more Kyuubi-like, for lack of better words. But I called you here because I have a mystery to unfold, and it is possible only you can answer it. Naruto frowned as he considered this, then nodded. I will do what I can to help, Hiashi-sama. Hiashi nodded before he stood and motioned Naruto to follow him. They walked until they reached a stairwell guarded by 2 Hyuga branch members. Hiashi nodded to them and they stepped aside, opening the door for them. Hiashi, as they walked down the darkened stairs, began to speak of the previous days and how the routine eventually returned to him until he was the stoic clan head again, showing no emotion at all, to better hide his pain, which was now double what it was originally. Then one day he was told to come to the resting ground, as they called it. At the urgency in the man's voice, Hiashi hurried until he was led to the family mausoleum and saw something he hadn't expected to see. The door to the family crypt was split in half down the middle, and at first they thought some bold grave robbers intended to steal whatever finery his past family members were buried in, but then he realized the door wasn't caved in, but out, and Hinata's body was gone. Searching everywhere, they found no intruders, nothing out of place. They scoured the grounds until Hiashi himself began searching his family's quarters. At this point, Hiashi stopped his narration and unlocked a heavy door they had stopped in front of. Naruto got a strange feeling in his stomach, an excited, almost giddy feeling, as he could smell something familiar. Hiashi, noticing his reaction, nodded as he opened the door. In the dimly lit room, a figure lay on a bed, curled into a ball and weeping. Her voice was strained as if she had been crying for some time, and Hiashi confirmed it from outside of the doorway. When I found her, she was curled up in the corner of her room, gripping one of your old jackets, and wouldn't stop crying. That was a week ago, and she won't eat or drink. When we have talked with her, she keeps asking the same thing, and when we can't answer her, she breaks down and cries again. Naruto looked at Hiashi expectantly until he heard her voice. It sounded hoarse and full of sorrow, and Naruto felt his own heart hurt when he heard it. He would know that voice anywhere, and when he heard it, he stepped into the room. Naruto-kun, where is Naruto-kun? When no one answered, she broke into a new series of heart-wrenching sobs that brought tears to Naruto's eyes. Without hesitation, he went over, heart hammering in his chest, and rested his hand on her shoulder. I'm here, Hinata-chan. Hinata's head slowly raised and she blinked her eyes at him. As he thought, She had the fox ears which were almost blue in color and the tail as well which was restricted by the clothing she still wore, but it was undoubtedly there, and it was undoubtedly Hinata. Her eyes seemed to focus as she saw him clearly for the first time, and her face broke into a grin as she dove at him, wrapping her arms around his waist. A new wave of tears rushed from her, but they were tears of joy as she rubbed her face against his chest, breathing deeply of his essence, reveling at his proximity, in his embrace as she never dared before. Hiyashi did the one thing very few people had ever seen him do. He smiled, until Hinata said something that made him fall back on his heels in shock. Master. My master. Hiyashi tried not to frown at the young man that was being held in a death grip by his returned daughter. The changes in her, while obvious, were not something he couldn't overlook. The physical changes, that is. The obvious emotional changes were a little harder to swallow. So you don't really know why this has happened? Naruto shook his head as Hinata purred and groomed him, a content smile on her face. Hiyashi had never seen anything like it. He was not a great animal lover, so he had never observed or even listened to stories about animal mating rituals and such, or how mated animals acted to and around each other. To be honest, watching his eldest daughter now return to life purr like a big house cat and lick and pat Naruto with her hands and fingers, fussing over the boy, embarrassed the hell out of him. Especially when they were still in the cell below the manor and she stopped crying finally, and began to lick his neck and cheek. Hiyashi had to clear his throat 3 times before they took notice of him. What she was doing now was not much better, but it was a step away from earlier. The clan head tried not to blush openly, but the open affection his shy daughter was displaying to the young special Jonin was both brazen and unsettling. Naruto merely shrugged as he tried not to squirm or giggle. I'm not sure what brought her Haku back to life. My resident is unsure also. Neither of us have seen or heard anything about this before. If he's stumped, then so am I. Hiyashi nodded with a slight frown, before he looked at Hinata. Daughter, how do you feel? Hinata looked up at Hiyashi and blinked at him, then went back to grooming Naruto as if the man had said nothing of importance. Hiyashi frowned deeper and almost snapped at her, but Naruto held up his hand, stalling him. Hold on, Hiyashi-sama. Turning his head to look at Hinata, he smiled. Hinata-chan, please answer any questions your father has for you. Hinata looked into Naruto's eyes, then nodded to him before she moved forward quickly and kissed his lips without the hint of a blush or any sign of shame or shyness. Yes, my master, she said in a quiet voice. Hiyashi tried not to blush again at the open display of affection, but asked her again to quickly cover it up. How do you feel? Hinata her head to the right and thought about it before she answered him. Wonderful. It feels like I've been asleep and I rested better than I have ever before, and I have something I have always wanted now. She said as she hugged Naruto tightly, making him blush lightly under his eyes. Hiyashi nodded as he took a sip of his tea. Once he was satisfied, he looked at Hinata again. Why do you call him master? Hinata's brow furrowed as she thought about it, then shook her head. I cannot explain it. There is something about Naruto-kun that makes me want to submit to him, and when I do I feel happy. I don't want to disobey him or make him unhappy. I was thinking about when I woke up, and I was in my room, when I thought of being in my old room again, and without Naruto-kun, I was suddenly empty inside and I just wanted to cry. Naruto rubbed Hinata's hand in a reassuring manner, which wasn't lost on Hiyashi, before she smiled at her long love and continued her narration. Once the tears started, I couldn't stop them and I was overcome with sorrow. All I wanted was my master, and if he didn't come to claim me, then I wanted to die again. Naruto felt a pull of sadness when he thought of Hinata being dead again, and when he did, immediately Hinata looked at him and frowned with a slight whine. Master. Naruto looked at her and saw the sudden sadness there in her eyes and immediately smiled and pushed it aside. I'm sorry Hina-chan, I just got sad thinking of you being gone again. After a few searching looks in Naruto's beautiful blues, Hinata smiled and kissed him quickly on his cheek before turning back to her father with a frown. Hinata's tail found her hands and she played with the tuft of fur on the end a bit nervously as if confused. I don't know why I felt or feel like this and I don't know why I'm not embarrassed, but what I do know for a fact is I do not care. She let go of her tail and looked into her father's eyes with a bit of defiance that made him sit back slightly in surprise before she continued. I am his if he will have me, and nothing will change that. Naruto grinned at her words and took her hand with a smile. Of course I want you. Hinata blinked with a beaming smile on her face so bright it would rival Lee's on a good day before she squeezed his hand tight. Hinata turned back to Hiashi and again frowned at him, but as he tried to listen in, Kyuubi broke into his thoughts. It is the mating instinct. She has submitted herself to you as yours. Usually this is after, but based on her feelings for you from before she was probably already yours. Now that she has you, she wants nothing else than to make you happy. Her very existence is based on your happiness. If you are unhappy, she will be unhappy. If you are happy or pleased with her, it is like a constant mini orgasm for her. It should be interesting to see how she will react once she is in heat. Wait, so you're saying I have to take her too? Naruto said, voice rising as he began to see the injuries Hinata could deal to him with the gentle fist. A distinct possibility, she will probably be your beta, but I have a feeling she will be a tough one. You better eat your Wheaties, boy. I think you'll need it, but you can't do the tango with just one person. Naruto blinked at this then frowned. So you're saying all demons are like this? The great fox shook his head negatively. No, in fact all demons are independent until they become mated. Once they are mated then the bonding process begins. I am thinking that Hinata and Haku are like this because you created them. Since my essence and your emotions combined in them, it regenerated them in some kind of odd symbiosis. It's like the demon mating drive, only compounded. I do not fully understand it, and given time I will dredge my memories. I suggest in the meantime you enjoy yourself. It's not every day that you get to have two women fawn over you. Naruto frowned as he pleaded with the Fox Lord. Wait. Hold it please. If that's the case, why is Hinata-chan like this, and Haku-chan is like she is? Shouldn't they both be the same level of intelligence? The Kyuubi shrugged impatiently. The only thing I can think of is based on the time. You poured your heart and my yokai into Hinata the same day she died. With Haku, you did it the next day when you buried her. It is possible her soul had fled before you did it, so with no active consciousness, she was as I told you originally, a clean slate waiting for you to write on it. Naruto looked thoughtful for a minute as he considered the great fox's words. Then, why did Haku rise from the grave long before I got to Wave, and Hinata only when I left Konoha? The great Myobu shook his head before he shrugged at Naruto. Perhaps it was a matter of time, perhaps it was your proximity for Haku and your absence for Hinata. I do not have the answers to these questions. Instead of worrying over things that we cannot solve, worry more about what you will do with two mates. I'm sure your Bachan will not be very pleased. Naruto's mind began to whirl as he considered the implications of this new ability, completely ignoring the thought of mates and more importantly the beating Tsunade would probably give him. What if Naruto could bring anyone back to life? The Fox Lord however stomped the ground in front of Naruto, grabbing his attention again. Not advisable. For one, they will come back subservient to you, so in essence you will have another mate to deal with. And for the most part we do not know how or why you were able to raise either of them. Doing it again could be a problem since we do not know any particulars of the process. Now leave me. I have things to contemplate. Naruto grumbled as he exited his mindscape. It seemed like the fox was going to keep him guessing anyway. Naruto had returned to reality just in time as Hinata growled, her ears laying back against her head at Hiashi, and the man had slammed his teacup to the tabletop with an angry exclamation. How dare you? You won't have it so good ever again. The elders will demand you wear the seal, especially when they find out you're alive and under another man's control. Hinata practically spit at Hiashi as she exchanged heated words with him. And I am no longer the timid fool you and your council emotionally abused for so long. With this new life I have new courage and new conviction. I will not stay here under your roof any longer. I will stay with my master. Hiashi glared from Hinata to Naruto as Naruto tried to figure out what he missed, but did not get much of a chance to puzzle it out as Hiashi stood to his feet. Then I suggest you go now, while I still feel generous enough to let you leave of your own power, but know this, once you leave that door, you are no longer welcome here. Naruto stood to his feet as well as he looked between the two quickly. Wait, what's going on? Hiashi looked at Naruto, and his features softened slightly as he noticed Naruto's genuine confusion and concern. I apologize to you, Naruto-san, but it seems Hinata has become more willful and less obedient than when she was previously alive. Hinata had a hand on Naruto's arm and rubbed it affectionately before she looked at Hiashi again, but she openly scowled at him. It is not that I am less obedient, father, my allegiance lies with the man that means more to me than life itself. Naruto-kun is the reason I am here again, I can sense that, and I will not let anything stand in my way of making him happy. Leaving me here to live, hidden in shame, hidden from the world when I could at least be with the man I love would be stupidity on my part, and while I was once meek and timid, I was never stupid. Naruto looked again from one to the other, then took a deep breath and let it out with a sigh. Hiashi-sama, right now I am going to do something I rarely do because I am not good at it, be the voice of reason. Hinata has been dead for some time, her attitude has obviously changed in that time, so why don't we take time to rediscover who she is now before we make quick decisions, especially ones we might regret later. Hiashi gazed evenly at Naruto, then nodded before he gave a slight bow to the young man. That would seem to be the best course. Remember this day, Naruto-san, for it is the day that you gave a clan head wisdom. I will leave her in your care. I do not even know if the clan will accept her as a whole with this new development. I was being hasty. Even though it was said quietly, Hinata and Naruto both heard the older man's words as he left the room. I just wanted my daughter back. Hinata's ears followed him as he left the room, but she said nothing else. Naruto, unsure of what else to say, looked at Hinata, who turned then smiled and rubbed her face against his shoulder. While he was happy to have her back again, he began to wonder what other traits she had acquired. He should have worried more about what would happen in the future. Oh, it took some coaxing, and finally Naruto tying a black string around Hinata's neck to get her to come out of the Hyuga manor. Even though it never felt completely like a home, she felt some level of comfort there. Much like Haku, once he had a symbol of his dominance on her, she grabbed onto him and followed him happily. That and the stupid fox insulting him again helped. You have to collar her too stupid. Naruto grumbled, but no further problems occurred immediately. The clan members at the main gate watched as they walked by in open-mouthed shock, but said nothing as they passed. Hinata looked around somewhat nervously at all the people and the stares she was receiving, and because of it, clung tightly to Naruto's arm and would not leave his side. A quick detour to Tenten's weapon shop proved to be a mistake on his part though. Naruto and Hinata walked into the store and stopped at the counter. Tenten's voice came from the back and sounded cheerful. I'll be right there. Naruto nodded absently as he watched Hinata. Her ears would flick back and forth and swivel in every direction continuously as her eyes darted around the room. Hinata seemed to be displaying the same curiosity that a cat would at being in a new place. Very similar to Haku, she stayed close to Naruto, but she did step a few paces away as her whiskers twitched cutely. Tenten emerged from the back and grinned at him. Oh hey, hey. Tenten's voice trailed off as she pointed to Naruto's head and he remembered the physical changes he had gone through. Naruto shrugged it off as he rambled through an explanation. Sorry Tenten, it's me and it's a long story. I'll definitely explain it to you, but not right now, I'm in a bit of hurry. I need another of those collars with a lock and leash please. Tenten nodded dumbly, still staring at Naruto as she reached up and took a collar off the wall and a lock by touch because she seemed so engrossed in his new appearance she pulled another leash from the wall and placed it next to the collar and lock. Naruto grinned as he pulled out his toad wallet. Same price. Tenten only nodded as she was still staring at him, and he counted out the money and left it on the counter before he gathered up his purchase and walked over to Hinata. Naruto reached up as she turned to him, and broke the string around her neck, which made her whimper as it fell from her, but then she began to bounce happily when he fitted the collar to her neck, then locked it around her throat. Hinata grinned and threw herself into Naruto's arms, surprising him. Master. I don't know why but I'm so happy. Naruto could only nod with a light chuckle before he turned and waved to Tenten. Hinata grinned as she looked at Tenten and waved also as she clung to Naruto's arm. Bye Tenten, she said as if she had always been here and was returning from a trip. Tenten waved back, but her facial expression didn't change as her eyes rolled up in her head and she collapsed behind the counter. Oh, when they got to the Namikaze compound, entering was simple, until they actually got into the house proper. Naruto opened the front door and escorted Hinata in, and Hinata immediately began to explore, ears and nose twitching. Naruto chuckled before he created a shadow clone. Take a note to Bachan and let her know when she is available that I need to talk to her about a new wrinkle in my situation. The clone nodded and gave a jaunty salute. You got it boss. It said as it turned and ran out the front door. Naruto turned around and saw Hinata staring at him in expectation. Naruto blinked at her then walked over, a question on his face. Hinata, is something wrong? Hinata seemed to fidget a little before she looked at Naruto, a serious expression on her face. Naruto-kun, I didn't lie to you, I do love you, and I want us to be together. Naruto grinned at her before he wrapped her in an embrace and she settled into it with a content sigh. I know Hinata-chan, I do not and did not doubt you, that is why this is now your new home, but this is going to be an odd situation. Hinata pulled back and looked into his face. What do you mean? What he meant came bounding out of a bedroom and down the stairs in just a pair of black panties screaming, Master! Master! Until she saw Naruto hugging Hinata. At that point she stopped halfway down the stairs and began to growl. Naruto blinked at Haku and was about to say something when he felt Hinata also begin to growl. With a frown Naruto looked down at the woman he was holding and took a step back as she dropped down into a crouch, ears laid back and claws extended. Naruto blinked as he looked between the two, and Shizune stood at the top of the stairs, but was frozen in shock as she saw who the other woman in the house was. Hinata. Hinata though was only paying attention to the one woman who had usurped her place beside Naruto, and Haku did the same as they continued to eye each other. Hinata's eyes did not leave Haku as she spit out at Haku. Naruto-kun is mine, you don't belong here. Haku, not to be outdone in her own rough language, pointed at Naruto then thumped her chest twice shouting, Haku master. Hinata's eyes began to blaze as her legs tensed up to spring. No. Mine. And Haku's legs bunched up the same way and mimicked Hinata. Mine. With that declaration, both women charged each other and the fur began to fly as they tore into each bit of cloth or flesh they could. Claws and teeth flashed trying to find purchase in fur and flesh, but neither female would relinquish to the other. Naruto blinked in shock as the screaming of the two females increased, but neither seemed to be able to get the better of the other. The Kyuubi chuckled in amusement as he sat up and crossed his front paws in front of himself. Well, now this is a welcome change. My bet's on the one you call Haku, feral as so, don't you think? Naruto frowned as he ignored his tenant and considered wading in and breaking it up, but before he could act he was glad he didn't, as Shizune charged down and attempted to do just that, but then got slugged by both females at the same time, who focused on her, then went back to tearing at each other as she hit the floor. Naruto was at a loss for words until again, the Kyuubi broke in. You know, you should be ready to name one of them as Alpha as soon as this little squabble is done. Naruto frowned as the two women continued to growl and fight but looked inward. What do you mean? Well, this is a battle for dominance. When one of them screams out in pain, they will break apart, and the one that screamed out will then be submissive to the one who won. Naruto nodded, still not quite understanding, until one of the women indeed screamed out in a high pitch, and Hinata pulled away from Haku, rubbing her shoulder. Haku looked smugly at Hinata and began to groom herself, but when Hinata looked back at Naruto as he watched, her face screwed up in determination, then charged and pounced on Haku again, now giving much better than she got. Naruto blinked at the great fox in his stomach as he gave a troubled sound. Uh-oh. Naruto looked inward and growled at the fox lord in worry. Uh-oh. What do you mean uh-oh? No uh-oh. Uh-oh, not good. The Kyuubi made a thoughtful sound then shrugged with a grin. Well, usually one will accept the other as alpha, and back off, taking up her position as the beta female, but in some rare circumstances, the designated beta will not accept the situation, and try to force a change by attacking the alpha again. Naruto looked back at the females who were still rolling around on the floor, scratching and biting, and Shizune who was still knocked out behind them. Okay, so if she wins again, no big deal, right? The Fox Lord shook his head. No. The problem is the conventions have been broken, and on an instinctual level they both know that one will have to die in order to settle this between them. Naruto's eyes bugged out as he screamed at the Myobu. What? Are you serious? I don't want them to kill each other. The Kyuubi smirked at him before it shrugged noncommittally. Then you need to exert your will as the alpha male. Naruto blinked in confusion then in worry as he heard one of the women, possibly Haku, scream out in pain, but they still continued to fight. What do I need to do? The great fox smirked as a paw came up and he scratched at a tooth with a single claw. Why? You have to stop them, of course. Yell at them, then cuff them both. They need to be made to understand what your will is. Naruto frowned as he considered it but then shook his head. I don't think I can do that. I don't want to hit them. Another scream of pain, followed by blood being splashed around as the two continued to fight and roll over each other, shocked him as the great fox sucked his teeth in disgust at his container. Then be ready to bury one of them again. Naruto's mind rebelled at this as he realized that he really cared about both women, and even if he didn't, he just couldn't let one of them die. With a little hesitation, Naruto got closer and raised his voice. All right, that's enough. I need you to stop. But neither woman took notice and continued to brawl even as Haku cried out, and Naruto could now see her blood flowing from what looked like a deep cut on her shoulder very close to her jugular. Naruto raised his voice and got a little closer and said a little more forcefully, "Hey, come on, cut it out now." But the two females continued to battle and Naruto was at a severe loss for what to do, until a stray foot caught him in the crotch, sending pain shooting from his family jewels to his chest. Naruto doubled over and grabbed himself for a few seconds with both hands before he began to growl with his temper finally gone. Naruto's eyes flashed red as he finally yelled, "Knock it off." Naruto's roar shocked both females who looked at him and saw the fury on his face, and both women's faces fell in fear as he strode over and first picked Hinata up by one arm, and swatted her on her rear, causing her to yelp in pain before he released her. He then picked Haku up in a similar fashion, and swatted her on her rear with just as much force, causing her to also yelp and squat there at his feet when he let her go. Both girls squatted side by side, eyes misting over as they stared up at him expectantly. "I'm not going to have this in my house. You both will get along, or there will be hell to pay, and hell's name is Naruto." Hinata rubbed her backside, at the same time Haku was rubbing hers and a few tears fell from her eyes. "Naruto-kun, you spanked me." Naruto looked at her and growled, causing her ears to fold back as she leaned slightly away from him. "And there will be more in the future if the two of you don't accept the fact that you're both mine. You are both equal. I will not have you fighting for dominance in my house. The only dominant one here is me." The Myobu nodded in approval, which gave Naruto a surge of confidence as he got an idea. Naruto quickly leaned over and grabbed Haku's collar and pulled her to his right side despite her reluctance to go. Looking at Hinata, he shook Haku lightly by her collar. "Haku." He then thumped his chest and growled, "Master." At Haku's triumphant smirk, Naruto reached over and pulled Hinata to his left side by her collar, her ears still folded back, and he faced Haku. He shook Hinata by her collar and did the same thing. "Hinata." Then he immediately thumped his chest. "Master." Haku's ears flattened and her face fell slightly, but then Naruto grabbed her collar and shook them both as he brought them side by side in front of him, pushing them until they were face to face, less than an inch apart. As they looked at each other, Naruto put a hand on each of their shoulders and slowly worked a smile on his face. "Mine." Haku looked at Naruto and blinked before her tail waved behind her. "Master." Naruto nodded to her, still smiling in encouragement. "Yes, Master." Hinata looked at Naruto but only with a slight frown. "So, you want both of us?" Naruto shook his head before he sighed as he took a couple of deep breaths, calming himself completely.